scarred and tattooed hand slides the bag of amphetamine across the table. The undercover cop's eyes settle on it. To everyone in the room, he's just another seasoned buyer, here to secure his next fix. Across the table, the dealer is confident in the product sitting between them. It's the best on the market, the kind of amphetamine that commands a high price. The cop's gaze lingers on the bag just a moment too long. There's a subtle shift in the air. The dealer notices. Suspicion creeps into his expression. The grin begins to fade. The cop knows the stakes. Hesitation could blow his cover or worse. Keeping his composure, he dabs a finger into the powder and presses it to his tongue. It's a calculated move, one designed to maintain the illusion. It isn't enough. The dealer's posture stiffens. He expects more, a true test of the product. This is the downside of being undercover. You have to do a lot of bad things all in the line of duty. Today, we'll take a look at the dangerous world of undercover work on this episode of the Infographics Show. Insane true stories from undercover cops. Number 6. The Speed Connoisseur. The receiver of the gift we just mentioned is Neil Woods, arguably Britain's most well-known undercover drugs cop. He befriended some of the nastiest people in England from 1993 to 2007, putting men behind bars collectively for over 1,000 years. He had arranged to meet a highly unstable local drug dealer in a bar, a notoriously dangerous bar. Woods had been working on this mark for a while, grooming him so he could get higher up the food chain and find out who the suppliers were. Just minutes earlier, at the other end of the bar, a man had been beaten senseless over a drug debt. The debt was a measly $15. That's all it took to send someone to the floor, blood pooling on the grimy tiles. Woods knew that if anyone in that place got so much as a whiff he was a cop, his next step would be the hospital. He had to take that speed, a drug he had never touched before. He joined the drug squad in his early 20s, diving headfirst into a world that demanded he become someone else. Before long, he was making friends with addicts in towns where his face wasn't known. It was the mid-90s and the British Home Office was concerned about rising drug use. It wasn't just speed and ecstasy in rave clubs, but addictive narcotics. For years, Neil Woods' life would revolve around coke, crack, and smack, a trio of drugs that fueled crime and desperation in Britain's most poverty-stricken neighborhoods. He was thrown into a world of violence and addiction, watching homeless addicts that he'd befriended dying of overdoses and hanging around no-go bars that maniacs made their home. One of those maniacs was the man telling him to take a hit of the powder he just slid across the table. He wasn't the kind of guy that he said no to, so Woods did as he was told. He indulged in Britain's finest speed. He later described the feeling as a white light, white heat rush. The dealer wasn't exaggerating. When the rest of that speed, pink champagne as it was called, was taken back to the lab, they found it was 40% pure. The average in England at the time was 5 to 7%. Woods spent the next 24 hours scrubbing every corner of his house. He didn't sleep for 3 nights, and then he came down like a crashed plane. These were early days of his undercover existence. It was a secret life that he wouldn't fully explain to his wife and kids, even to other cops, which was probably a good thing. He later found out that some of the cops in his town were on the payroll of some powerful drug dealers. And that's why when you work undercover, you tell no one. On one of Woods' jobs, he befriended a heroin dealer, a necessary but dangerous part of the role. One day, he knocked on the dealer's door only to be grabbed by the collar and hauled inside. Before he could process what was happening, he was face to face with the dealer, who brandished a samurai sword. The sharp steel edge was pressed against Woods' throat, and with spit flying out of his mouth, the dealer accused Woods of being drug squad. Woods was sure that his cover had been blown. The tension was broken when he heard someone laughing in the background. It was the dealer's girlfriend. The dealer cracked up too as he drew the sword away from Woods' neck. They'd just been trying to scare him. The woman, still in stitches, slapped her boyfriend on the back and said, "I thought he was actually going to say he was DS for a second." She might have been right. This was Woods' new world, and as he later said in an interview, every year went on, without fail, the people were more violent. In 2001, he very nearly became a victim of this escalating violence. He'd spent 6 months earning the trust of a high-level dealer, slowly working his way into the inner circle. Now he needed evidence, something concrete to bring the operation down. That meant getting this guy on camera, handing over the drugs. They arranged to meet after Woods had asked to score, and he assumed it would be a one-on-one deal. But when he arrived, there were 3 men waiting. 2 of them were complete strangers. On Woods' jacket was a tiny hidden camera disguised as a button. It was his only lifeline, and if anyone noticed it, he would be in big trouble. They met in a car park on an industrial estate outside of town. The guys got out of the car and took a big block of cocaine from the truck. One of the guys immediately became suspicious, and without warning, Woods was shoved hard against a wall. The guy's fingers started fiddling with the camera button, which Woods later said was not exactly James Bond quality. If he ran, he was dead. So not breaking character, he became incensed that someone would accuse him of being a cop, pushing the guy away like he was about to hit him. The guy wasn't giving up, screaming to his mate that Woods was an undercover police. The dealer vouched for him, but Woods, still pretending to be upset, said he was going. He didn't need the drugs, not from someone accusing him like that. He started walking across the car park only to hear the padding of footsteps behind him. He was expecting a bullet in the back or a baseball bat across the head, but neither came. It was the guy he knew apologizing. He even gave Woods a big rock of crack as a peace offering. Over at the car, the guy was shouting at Woods that he was a cop. Woods was almost at the exit when he heard the sharp screech of tires. He didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. He was pretty sure the accuser had now managed to convince the others that he was in fact a cop. He glanced over his shoulder to see the car barreling toward him at high speed. At the last second, the car barely a meter away, Woods leaped over a barrier and ran for his life. A few hours later, he was back with the special operations team, and he told them his cover was blown. One of the team told him that the intel had revealed the men were armed. Woods knew he had a lucky escape. After all those years, he figured something out. The better the cops became at infiltrating gangs and getting snitches to talk, the nastier the gangs became. Their growing paranoia always led to an escalation of violence. Today, Woods is an outspoken advocate, fighting to end the war on drugs in the UK. It's a war that consumed years of his life and one he knows can't be won. Very few people can do this job, and as you'll see now, those who can sometimes forget which side they're on. Number 5. Losing yourself. Keith Banks was a clean-cut 17-year-old kid when he joined the force in Australia. It was the late 70s and early 80s, and heroin addiction had become endemic in towns and cities across the country. Banks was idealistic. He wanted to change the world. So at 21, he grew out his hair, got a few piercings, and tried to infiltrate the gangs that were all doing the trafficking and dealing. Banks embraced this new identity, fully immersing himself in every second of his fabricated life. Before he went undercover, he never so much as smoked a cigarette. But within months of hanging out with the gangs, Banks was smoking cigs and weed and had taken to regular binge drinking. If he ever bumped into people he knew, his story was he'd been kicked out of the force for drug use. He spent every day of his life buying heroin, trying to move higher and higher up the distribution chain. Once a week, he would use a public payphone to call the drug squad and feed them back the information he gleaned. The hardest part was befriending people who, despite their involvement with drugs, he took a shine to. Banks was befriending lower-level guys, people he liked, and then he had to send them to prison. He became friends with many of them, even meeting their families. The line between reality and my underworld identity became blurred, he later said. It changed him. He became menacing and violent like the character he was playing. And it wasn't just when he was among other dealers. He was like that all the time. One of the men he hung out with was a double murderer who was wanted for escaping from prison. He was a very dangerous man. One night, Banks went to a nightclub with the dealer, blending seamlessly with his long hair and earrings. But as he approached the bar, he froze. The bartender recognized him and called out his name. They were old school friends. Banks felt his pulse quicken. Now more than ever, Banks had to become the maniac he'd been playing for so long. He started screaming and cursing, threatening the bartender for confusing him with someone else. He later said his dealer friend looked at him with penetrating, dark black, soulless eyes that reminded him of the serial killer Charles Manson. "He called you Keith," said the guy. "Why did he call you Keith?" Banks managed to talk his way out of it, or at least he thought he did. Sometime later, he walked into a flat in Brisbane to score drugs. As soon as the door closed behind him, one of the men in the room grabbed him and he felt the end of a shotgun against the side of his head. The man demanded that Banks do some lines of speed with the boys. It was a test, so Banks did as he was told, but still everyone looked suspicious. In another case, he spent the evening with a group of dealers as they talked about what they would do if they ever discovered someone they knew was undercover. The answer was torture and death. Unsurprisingly, when he finally resigned from the force, he was diagnosed with chronic PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Now let's look at a case where an undercover cop forgets he's a cop and goes rogue. Number 4. Cop Killer Cop. July 4th, 1995, Yuma, Arizona. Hurry up, he's shooting guns. He's firing rounds! Hurry up!" Those were the words of Yuma Police Lieutenant Dan Elkins to the operator on a 911 call. The operator barely had time to process them as the sound of gunshots erupted, followed by an ominous silence. Elkins, alongside Department of Public Safety Sergeant Mike Crow, had been cut down in the hail of bullets. The man who fired the gun was their colleague, a sheriff's deputy named Jack Hudson. Hudson had been working undercover for the Southwest Border Alliance Narcotics Task Force and had become a drug addict in the process. Elkins, Crow, and a technician had gone to the evidence room that evening to make sure everything was in order. Recently, there'd been a spate of mysterious thefts from the room, so they thought it was best to check. When they got there, they found Hudson standing beside broken safes and empty lockers, a 9mm weapon in his hand. None of the others were armed, but Hudson didn't give them a chance. He opened fire, killing 2 cops, before turning the gun on the technician, only for the gun to jam. In his addiction, Hudson had gone rogue, stealing drugs and weapons from the evidence room and selling the guns for more drugs. He was so high at the time of the murders, he later said he didn't even remember doing it. Still, he was clear-headed enough to put another round in his gun after Crow had pleaded, "Please don't shoot me again." Hudson fired into his head, killing him instantly. He was arrested outside in the car park. Detectives later went to his house and found amphetamines, methamphetamines, marijuana, and 18 firearms. He died in prison in 2017. Now let's look at what happens when undercovers befriend murderers. Number 3. The Habitual Confessor. June 6, 2012, Bristol, England. 32-year-old Claire Holland is knocking back drinks at Seamus O'Donnell's Irish pub in the city center. At approximately 11:15 p.m., she walks out the door and into the street. That's the last time anyone will see her, including her 4 children. Dive teams searched the harbor and police interviewed hundreds of people, but they couldn't find a body, and there was a lack of CCTV evidence. Without a body or witnesses, the case quickly went cold. Still, detectives had their suspicions, and high on the list was Darren Osmond, a 41-year-old chef battling a serious alcohol problem. He was also the father of one of Holland's 4 children. They had broken up years before she went missing, but he was still in her life. On the night she disappeared, they'd arranged to meet, but according to Osmond, she didn't show up. In 2019, he was on a night out in Devon, and in a drunken state, he called the police. He said that he couldn't handle the guilt anymore, and when the operator pressed him further, Osmond said he knew what had happened to Holland. Detectives were soon at his house. He was obviously still drunk when he admitted, "I gave some money to someone and they had her killed." But this wasn't the first time he'd confessed. In 2014, he told a roommate that he strangled Holland and had thrown her body into the Avonmouth docks, 9 miles outside of Bristol. Then, in 2018, he was drunk in a pub when he told a man he'd paid someone £500 to have Holland executed. So, there he was in 2019 confessing again, and again he was drunk. Unfortunately for the detectives, a drunken confession from an unstable, raging alcoholic is not usually enough to charge someone with a crime. The next morning, Osmond claimed he didn't remember making the phone call. Police knew Osmond was a violent man, someone capable of murder. After Holland gave birth to their child in 2008, the household spiraled into chaos. Alcohol-fueled domestic violence tore through their lives, leading to the child being taken into foster care. Though the two kept in touch over the years, their relationship was anything but amicable. Osmond harbored a simmering resentment, blaming Holland for their child's removal, a motive that couldn't be ignored. Police knew there was a good chance he was guilty, but with no evidence, they had to come up with a way for him to incriminate himself even further. That was about the time Patty O'Hara came onto the scene, a hard-drinking petty criminal barfly who had moved into an apartment not far from Osmond's place. O'Hara was a cop, whose real name remains a mystery to all but a chosen few. In 2020, O'Hara started hanging around the bars where Osmond was a regular drinker. He was new to the area and in need of new friends, and that's how he met Osmond. One of those first few nights out, Osmond told O'Hara he was struggling for money. "No problem," said O'Hara. He could find him some work moving boxes of counterfeit and stolen clothing. After that, they often met for 10-hour drinking sessions at O'Hara's flat, where they would kick back and watch soccer on the TV. O'Hara was perfect, turning into the kind of heavy drinker Osmond felt at home with. He became a lifesaver, often driving Osmond to his hospital appointments. As their relationship progressed, O'Hara began allowing Osmond to join him on his drug deals. Unknown to Osmond, the cannabis they were selling came directly from the evidence room and was being sold to another undercover officer. The whole point of this was to show Osment that O'Hara was a lifetime criminal, to gain his trust and hopefully get him to talk about how he'd once gotten away with murder. But O'Hara was careful, never pushing Osment too far, spending many nights talking about nothing and filling up 1,200 hours of secret recordings. Osment fell for it. He began to love his new friend, who he'd come to treat like an all-weather ally. In October 2021, on one of the recordings, Osment told O'Hara, "If I was getting married next week, you'd be my best man." It was around that time that Osment started to talk about his ex, Holland, who he said had vanished one night and was never seen again. He didn't admit to the murder, but he told O'Hara, "She ain't gonna be seeing the light of day again, don't worry about that." On another occasion, Osment said that he'd been having nightmares about Holland and her, quote, black eyes. It was almost as though she was haunting him, and that could be exploited. Sometimes at night, they'd take walks down by the estuary when Osment would hint that this was where he once dumped a body. Little by little, he opened up, once saying that the cops were putting the puzzle together but they haven't got all the bits. It wasn't until 2022 when O'Hara went in for the kill. He knew the murder was still troubling Osment psychologically, so one night he said he asked outright. He knew it was tearing Osment apart. Osment trusted O'Hara like a brother. He went into the details, explaining that he arranged to meet her that night, making sure to choose a spot where there wasn't any CCTV. He said it was easy. He just grabbed her and used what he said was his knife skills to cut her body. He said he weighed the body down so it would sink in the water, burned the clothes that he was wearing, and later put the knife in one of the other chef's kits. Osment said he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. O'Hara, always the perfect undercover, gave him a warm smile. That was the last time the two best friends met each other. In court, Osment's defense tried to argue that plying a man with booze and coaxing him into what they said was a false confession was unfair, but the evidence stood and Osment received a life sentence. In 2024, he launched an appeal, but it's unlikely that'll make any difference. Okay, so what happens when you cross a murderer with a group of fake hardcore gangsters? Number 2. A friend to gangsters. February 27, 1999, 12:45 a.m. 17-year-old Michelle Bright is last seen leaving a party of a 15-year-old friend in the small town of Goolgong in Australia's New South Wales Central West. Her badly beaten body is soon found near train tracks less than a mile away from her parents' house. The pathologist will say she died from homicidal violence of an undetermined etiology. It was a heinous crime that stunned the nation, prompting authorities to offer a huge $500,000 reward. By 2020, the reward was doubled to $1 million, reflecting the desperate urgency to solve the case. Goolgong was a tiny town, only home to 2,500 people. If the killer was local, which police suspected, then he should be fairly easy to find. They followed thousands of leads. They interviewed pretty much everyone in the town, but the one guy they missed was Craig Rumsby. The meat transport worker left town for the outskirts of Sydney about 2 weeks after the murder. The case went cold but was reopened in 2019. Detectives had a list of suspects, and now one of them was Rumsby. They'd already questioned him, but they didn't have enough to charge him. They needed to ensnare him, and knowing how impressionable he was, it was decided they'd introduce him to some high-level gangsters who were secretly undercover policemen. One night, a couple of these guys got to talking to Rumsby. They told him they needed a guy to help out with a job, and it was good money. They spent months after that grooming him, becoming his closest friend, thrilling him with dark tales from the underworld. In 2020, they introduced him to someone who they said was a corrupt cop on their payroll. If Rumsby had anything that needed fixing, this cop could do it for him. Rumsby had told him the cops had once tried to, quote, pin a murder on him, the murder of Michelle Bright, but he denied doing it. So 5 months later, his gang member buddies said they'd gotten word from their police contacts that the cops were now actively looking at him and that his name had come up in some case. One of the gangsters stressed that Rumsby was part of the family. He was a brother. But there was a catch. Loyalty came with conditions, and they couldn't afford any heat on them. The situation needed to be fixed. Rumsby played dumb, saying nothing. Later, one of the guys sent him a text explaining that this case his name had come up in was a murder that happened years ago out west. Rumsby texted back, adamantly denying any involvement. He insisted Bright was like a sister to him, a bond forged from growing up together. Again, the trap had failed. Rumsby had indeed known the victim. His house back then wasn't that far from her place. He made out that he'd been a friend to her. So after the authorities wrote a Facebook post about the new reward of $1 million, he wrote in the comments section, "It's so sad they haven't caught her killer. Michelle was like a sister to me. I feel sorry for the family." The next day, he was called to a hotel to speak with the big boss of the gang, a guy he'd rarely seen in the flesh. The boss said, "Look, if your name is connected to this murder, that brings heat on the family." He demanded honesty from Rumsby, otherwise they couldn't work together. Rumsby still didn't budge, saying that he knew nothing about the murder, so the cops moved to the next part of the plan. The boss approached Rumsby again, this time with copies of police documents he's supposedly gotten from his corrupt law enforcement mates. There were records about Rumsby, including a photo of a red Ford Falcon car. They were onto him, said the boss. It was just a matter of time before they got him. Back in 1999, after police had interviewed Rumsby on the phone about the murder, that same car was found in flames. The cops said the boss knew that Rumsby had driven it that night and had later destroyed it. The boss told him again that if he told the truth, they could get him out of this. Rumsby paused for a minute and then said one night he was out late near his house and he heard footsteps behind him. He looked back and it was his young neighbor, Michelle. He walked over to her, grabbed her, and put his hand over her mouth until she stopped breathing. The boss was skeptical, but Rumsby was adamant. He was telling the truth. He explained that night he'd been driving around in his Falcon when he stopped at the commercial hotel to speak to the publican. He then set off walking, and that's when he heard those footsteps. The boss said they needed to get this straight if they were going to get the cops off his tail. He needed to take them to Gulgong and show them exactly where he'd killed the girl. After that, said the boss, they would charter a private plane and fly him to another town where he could lay low until the heat died down. Night had already fallen when Rumsby took them to Barney's Reef Road in Gulgong, and that's where he had killed her and dragged her body over the road, pushing it into the scrub so no one would find it. He explained that when he went home, he had a beer, took a shower, washed his clothes, and went to bed. He told the guys when it was on the TV for the next 12 months, all he could think was, "What have I done?" As promised, they took him straight to the airport, but instead of finding a private plane waiting for him, there were a bunch of police officers and a pair of shiny handcuffs. His best friends handed him over. In court, age 56, Rumsby was sentenced to 32 years in prison with a minimum of 24 years. Okay, here's an undercover cop story like no other. Number 1. The Perfect Assassin. Future undercover assassin extraordinaire Gary Johnson grew up in the 50s in a small town in Louisiana. After serving in the Vietnam War as a military police officer, he returned to Louisiana to work at the sheriff's office. A few years later, he was embedded as an undercover cop in Port Arthur, Texas. There, he lived a double life, posing as a drug addict to gain the trust of street dealers and set them up for arrests. As with all undercover cops, Johnson had a knack for acting. He was what you might call a character, the last guy you would expect to be carrying a badge. After his stint as a fake addict, he earned himself a master's degree in psychology and intended to get a PhD in psychology from the University of Houston. But then he got a call from the Houston District Attorney's Office. His initial job involved reviewing videotapes of crimes and confessions, preparing them for prosecutors. But his success as an undercover drugs cop, combined with his sharp psychological acumen, set him on a very different path. It was decided that he would take on a new role, becoming Texas's most renowned contract killer. Informants helped the cops in spreading the word that the character Johnson was pretending to be was the greatest professional hitman in Houston. If you needed murder for hire, he was the man to call. Word on the street was no one did killing better. Satisfaction and security were guaranteed. It wasn't long until he had customers. He employed his powers of psychology to come across as believable, changing character for each person who would meet him and tell him why and how someone needed to die. If he was taking out a gangster, Johnson became a tough-looking biker. If the hit was a businessman, he would be a business-like assassin. For a wealthy woman who wanted her husband dead, he was a friendly-looking guy who was a good listener. He could turn into whatever he needed to be in whichever situation he found himself in. Rich, poor, educated, uneducated, dangerous, smart, stupid, Johnson was always able to become the perfect-looking assassin. But his weapon of choice wasn't a gun, it was a wire, hidden in his shirt, and it sent a lot of people to prison. He started his gig in 1989, and over the next 30 years he put over 60 of his clients behind bars. Johnson's colleagues said he was the chillest dude imaginable. He had a good heart, too. One time a woman hired him to whack her violent boyfriend. When Johnson found out this guy regularly beat her, instead of sending her to prison, he put her in touch with social service agencies. He also found her a therapist and got her a place in a woman's shelter. The defense in the trials would usually say Johnson manipulated his clients into requesting a murder, but he didn't see it that way. He once said, "That's all my job is, to help people open up. to get them to say what they really want, to reveal to me their deepest desires. He never killed anyone, but there is no doubt that Gary Johnson was the greatest fake hitman the world has ever seen. Which of these insane cop stories blew your mind the most? Was there one that left you speechless or had you on the edge of your seat? Let us know in the comments below. Now you need to watch victims who ended up being the bad guys, or have a look at this video instead.